There is not one shred of evidence in any of the Smith families or the cousins in their private letters, in their journals, nothing. I would challenge anyone to produce a source that they really feel is genuinely credible.
But, it doesn't seem crazy.
I don't believe that it's even doctrinally congruent.
I feel like a bad person if I disagree with you.
They're cherry-picking statements and they're not being honest. What sources do we have that Joseph Smith was using his seer stones to go and do treasure digging?
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Midnight Mormons. I'm your host, Cardinellis, and today I'm joined in the studio by Quinn and Brad Whitbeck, as well as via the interwebs, via Zoom specifically, with Hannah Stoddard, back by popular demand, here to tell us all about, what was the topic? Oh yeah, this is a good one. You say Joseph Smith was no treasure digger, ! Wow, them's be fighting words. Back it up. What's going on?
It definitely is. I think it's probably one of the sacred cows of modern academia circles in Mormonism.
He was a treasure digger,
right? Yeah. If you challenge that, or challenge the more magical worldview, it seems like that just.
Okay, so can I just say the only thing that popped up in my mind is I read Rough Stone Rolling by your boy right. Richard Bushman. I know he's your favorite. But,
absolutely.
Your bestie.
Yeah. I thought that he contextualized it very well, at least just in a way that sat fine with me. And he said it appeared that not a fascination, but an interest as a young man in the occult and treasure and magic and folklore was almost like a preparatory priesthood for the reality of God's power. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. That kind of makes sense to me. Nobody has to get indicted. We all walk away from this just fine. You know what I'm saying? But you say, heck no, he was no treasure digger. Don't you go slander on my prophet. So, yeah. So what do you got for us? What do you got to prove your thesis?
Yeah. Not only would I say, and this would be a bold statement, but I would say I would challenge anyone to produce a source that they really feel is genuinely credible. And we can go through some of those right here. And then number two, I don't believe that it's even doctrinally congruent. And that is another huge contention. People are like, oh, it's just fine if he was. I think we actually walked through the doctrine. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Brandon.
In general, is that what you're talking about? Or the treasure digging specifically?
Sorry, what was that? Sorry, you cut out.
Oh, sorry. Are you saying the treasure digging specifically or like folk magic in general?
Probably just both the folk magic and the treasure digging.
Wait, but why wouldn't folk... I guess, okay, so in my mind... By the way, I got no scratch in this game. I don't have like my thesis at some divinity school or a master's or a PhD at BYU about to get approved by somebody who thinks I got wrong think here. Okay. Sure. But like the Magi, for example, we know that the Koine Greek word for magus, just like Simon Magus, was not some kind of mistranslation of priest. It was a word they used specifically for wizards, practitioners of the dark arts, astrology. Basically, the unapproved magic of the Old and New Testament was magus or magi. Okay. And yet they're the ones that recognize Christ. And just because there's a higher and a lower priesthood, can't there be this other smaller stuff underneath there? And, sometimes they're nice and they're the first to recognize baby Jesus. Other times, they're jerks and they're trying to summon spirits. But like, can't it just be a stepping stone and we all walk out of this just fine? Do you have to get all of academia mad at us? I'm going to get like 50 emails for just having you on my show. You know what I'm saying? So, okay, so bring it up. But like, I don't see why this couldn't fit in the narration of Joseph Smith.
Okay, so basically what we're talking about here, and this is really important to understand, is it's not just, there's some people that you can dabble between. We're talking about two different forces, right? So there's not neutral territory. There's a really good quote, right? Elder Holland, he's like, there's not neutral territory. So there's God and he has power, and there's the devil and he has power. And if you look right at the definition of magic in the 1828 dictionary, it's dealing with the use of spirits. Well, Joseph Smith has a really masterful discourse. It's called Try the Spirits. And he says very specifically, he says that the only way for someone to be able to detect a false spirit from a true spirit and to be able to recognize the difference is through understanding the priesthood and understanding how God's order works. And then it's completely different from the devil. Everything the devil does is a complete counterfeit. So that is something to keep in mind too, because when you start getting into this conversation, you're like, John Dolan in his treasure digging article, back in the day, I don't know if it's still out there, but, he brings up, Joseph Smith using the handkerchief and giving it to Wilford Woodruff, right, to heal people. And he's like, oh, this is occultism. No, he's confusing, what might be counterfeits between the devil and God. So, or inverted pentagrams, right? Witchcraft and the occult, they use the inverted pentagram. Joseph Smith puts the inverted pentagram on the temple. So is Joseph Smith saying, oh, you know what the occultists use, it's the same as our stuff. Really, it's just the same. We're in the same church, or is something being hijacked or a counterfeit being produced? Yeah. So I just want to acknowledge that right out the gate, because I don't want that to be a confusion.
Because, honestly, that's been the majority of my attitude towards most folk magic stuff anyway. Has been that it's like, yeah, obviously there's counterfeits of this that are bad out there in the world, but like the majority of the stuff that was involved with Joseph Smith and his early life and his family's general involvement with the folk magic was not something that was evil, right? It didn't strike me that way when I was learning about what I have read, at least from Rough Stone Rolling and records like around the Jupiter Talisman and stuff like that.
Right. So I would say before we try to justify or figure out what's going on, first we have to figure out what sources are real and what sources are not.
Ooh,
right.
Okay. Sounds like you've done some digging. Hit us.
Well, yeah, you're not going to take the subject without that. So if you actually look at, investigate the sources in the first few chapters of Rough Stone Rolling, when it comes to the treasure digging sources, there's millions of footnotes. So once you actually get to the footnotes that specifically are about the Smith family and folk magic, the majority of them are going to be coming from Mormonism Unveiled. So that's
Quinn.
Oh no, Mormonism Unveiled.
Mormonism Unveiled.
So
yeah.
A few of those.
So Mormonism Unveiled, let's just make sure we're all on the same page here on where Mormonism Unveiled came from. It's published in 1834. It's the first
anti-Mormon book, right?
Yeah, it's really the first just bam opposition against Joseph Smith that just explodes like wildfire. Well, where did it come from? So it comes from most of the documentation comes from a man named Dr. Philastus Hurlbut. He was a member of the church. He was excommunicated from the church shortly after for immorality.
And Doctor was his first name.
And it was his first name. He was not really a doctor.
If I have another son, I'm going to name him Doctor. Because that is just awesome for the rest of his life. Yo, Dr. Ellis, get over here. Hi, I'm a doctor. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's awesome.
Exactly. So he, and he'd already been excommunicated from 2 other Christian denominations for immorality too. So he gets called into the High Council, and he just gives them the huge sob story, and he cries and he mourns, and they're like, you know what, we will let you, you're restored. He's like, I'm so sorry. And so they restore him back. He leaves that council meeting, and Joseph Smith says, he's the only man that's not fooled. And he's like, that man is not sincere. What's in that man's heart? He's not honest. Well,
and then he falsifies a ton of affidavits, right?
Did you say falsify?
Yeah. He falsifies like a ton of affidavits.
That is so debated. And I've seen research on both sides. I think there's compelling arguments on both sides. I can't take a stance for sure. I don't know if it matters a ton, but yes. They're definitely not affidavits like we think affidavits, where you go in the courthouse, it's notarized, there's, it's all above board. He's going home, he's writing down, oh, so-and-so said this. Some statements we know, like Isaac Hale did later say, yes, I did write that. So some of them I know are legit, but who knows? So jumping ahead in the story, Brandon. But yes, no, right? So he's not excommunicated yet, right? So he's still a member of the church. He gets caught saying, telling someone later, bragging that he deceived Joseph's God and the spirit by which he's actuated. So he's pulled back in. They're like, you're excommunicated for good. And he swears he's going to wash his hands in Joseph Smith's blood.
Whoa.
So
that escalated quickly.
Right. So
for real.
Then he gets funded. So he gets funded by an anti-mormon committee to go back east and gather up all of the dirt he can find on Joseph Smith and Joseph Smith's family. So he goes back east, he goes and he starts talking to the neighbors and everything else. And like Brandon said, there's debate, like, did he even really talk to some of the neighbors? Some people later said they came to him, but they wouldn't give him what he wanted to hear. So he walks away. But he gathers up all this information. He brings it back to Ohio. Before he can get it published, he gets convicted in court for threatening Joseph Smith's life.
Okay.
So it's a huge, they have a huge trial. This is in the Joseph Smith papers. Joseph Smith's praying. His life is on the line. Francis Hurlbut's threatening him. At the same time, it comes out that Hurlbut's wife had an affair with one of the ministers that he was working with. So basically, by now he is his reputation is so tarnished, he can't publish the material under his own name. So he gives it to a man named E.D. Howe, who publishes it. E.D. Howe, I'm trying to remember if it was his sister or his wife. A relative was actually a member of the church and had actually given money to Joseph Smith. He is opposed to Joseph Smith. So he publishes Mormonism Unveiled under his name. And these are the main sources. So like when you hear there was a man named Willard Chase, and Willard Chase said that Joseph Smith found his first seer stone while digging a well for Willard Chase, that's coming from Mormonism Unveiled. Who was Willard Chase? Willard Chase is literally the man who led the banditti to steal the plates from Joseph Smith, attacked him. His sister was a witch. So these are, and you go to Rough Stone Rolling, you're going to see Willard Chase said this, and it's quoted as accurate. So, and that here's our source. So that's where I sit down and I'm like, okay, whoa. When Mormonism Unveiled came out, the first presidency made a statement and said it was the most ridiculous stories that could be invented and a few affidavits. Oliver Cowdery writes his letters to W.W. Phelps, literally responding to this, saying this is nonsense. This is crazy. These are accusations against Joseph Smith's character. It says the first presidency in one of the Times and Seasons said the entire country was just getting enraged at Joseph Smith, which is another issue I take with a claim Richard Bushman makes where he says, oh, all sorts of faithful Christians in Joseph Smith's day were doing this. So it wasn't a big deal, really, because all sorts of faithful Christians in Joseph Smith's own day were literally ticked and getting incited to violence by these stories.
Oh, so you don't think that magic could have been as widespread as he suggests if it was leading people to anger, because that would insinuate that it was taboo even then. That's what you're saying, right?
Well, let me give you one thing. So we're talking here about, the Smith family was all involved in supposedly folk magic to some degree, right? Okay. So I come through one of the Smith's line. I come through Joseph Smith's cousin, Silas Sanford Smith. I will tell you, there is not one shred of evidence in any of the Smith families or the cousins in their private letters, in their journals, nothing, no kind of folk magic language, no kind of, private letter from Jesse Smith to so-and-so saying, we did this, or have you looked into
your Ouija board to the party on Friday night or whatever, right?
Not even like the vocabulary or the lingo.
Am I mistaken on, doesn't Lucy Mack Smith in a journal talk about circle magic at some point?
Okay, so that statement we have completely shredded. It's on our website.
Really?
That is the biggest manipulation of her source if you go read it in context. And actually,
tell us, how is it the big manipulation? Hit us.
So I don't have it all right here in front of me, but basically what she says is actually the opposite, where she says, I'm switching my theme now to talking about, so let's set this up for a second. Let me not get ahead of myself. So Lucy Mack Smith writes in her history that she's writing after Joseph Smith has died. She's dictating it, right?
Yeah.
And she's telling her story. Basically, she's trying to set the record straight on a lot of things. Because if you think about Lucy Mack Smith at this point, 3 of her sons have been killed.
Yeah.
The church has been driven to Utah, huge friction, factions all over the place, right? And she's near her dying. She's been maligned. She went through a very hard life. If you actually read her story, even it wasn't like, oh, Joseph Smith had his first vision and then persecution started. Their family went through a lot of really hard experiences long before that. Mm-hmm. So she's sitting down to tell her story. When she gets to the part about the angel Moroni, remember in context, Mormonism Unveiled has been out for over a decade at this point, plus a million other anti-Mormon publications. And everyone is saying that the minute you start talking about angels or anything, bam, you are into Satanism. So she says, I'm getting ready to talk about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon and the angel Moroni. She says, let not my reader suppose that when I go into this history, that means our family stopped working on a farm. I'm paraphrasing because I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but it's on the ldsanswers.org website. You can just type in Lucy Mack Smith, it will come up. But she says, don't think,
no. Okay, keep going.
But she says, don't think that we stopped all of our labor and got into the abracadabra and the magic circles and da-da-da-da-da. And then she starts talking about the angel Moroni. She never said, oh, we did this, or this was part of our culture, like nothing. There's nothing. She's saying, before I even start getting into spiritual experiences, I'm drawing a line right here. Don't think it's what you've heard, that our family was involved in X, Y, and Z. And then she moves on. You never see a shred of any of even the language or anything to suggest this was part of their family culture. And this is something else. Well, okay, I'm going to pause there. Sorry, I can get excited and I get going. I want to give you guys a chance to talk if you have a question. Or
Well, I'm just pulling up the article right now. Did Joseph Smith's mother, Lucy Mack Smith, say her family practice Abrak, magic circles, and soothsaying?
Right.
And you say here, basically, no contemporaneous Latter-day Saint source provides an indication that Joseph Smith involved himself in money digging activities. And then here's all the different quotes. Okay, cool. Wow.
So William Hamblin, who was a PhD at the University of Michigan, I wanted to get his name for sure. So he published a review in the Farms magazine that's actually excellent on this, totally shredding the idea that Lucy Mack Smith's quote should be used as
that she was involved in Abrak and
Right. So I think his treatment's pretty good. We add a little bit more from a different angle, but
wow.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, I'll have to look into
Okay,
this.
yeah. So, I mean, you got it all right here that apparently when she sat down in 1844, it was only a few months after the Carthage martyrdom. So, I mean, death was on the table. Persecution in Nauvoo was intensifying daily, and slander and vilification were daily trials. To the general public, the story of the Book of Mormon had been horribly twisted by men like Willard Chase and Hurlbut into a demonic account of dealings with the underworld. And
because if you go read these accounts, this is one of my other problems with people using Mormonism Unveiled as a source. They're cherry picking statements and they're not being honest. For any Latter-day Saint to use it, go read the full quote. Go read these affidavits. If we're going to say, oh, this is evidence of the Smiths being involved in folk magic, then let's use the evidence. Because you know what the evidence says? Oh, they were killing animals and doing ritual sacrifices.
And they were lazy.
Well, also, we have modern day equivalents. Like just the other day, for example, RFM and Bill Reel made some kind of Desnat exposed video where people have been sending us clips where like they say that somebody that was making slanderous jokes was like either a Kwaku in the comments or me or somebody from a fake profile that nobody's ever heard of and anybody could have started. And then John DeLynn the next day said, oh, the church, they send prostitutes to try and woo me away from my wife. And he shows screenshot shots of automated text messages from people like advertising their like OnlyFans profiles with like purchased email and phone lists. And it's obvious. And he says, oh, the church also took down my TikTok account. You know, it's like, I mean, we've gotten 3 affidavits in the modern day by anti-Mormons, no different than Dr. Hurlbut. All right. And they all cheated on their wives too, which is really interesting. It's kind of like a theme. But anyway, it's like all of the modern affidavits that we've had against us are like laughable garbage. You know what I'm saying? how can you necessarily trust Mormonism unveiled?
Well, think about it this way.
But.
Okay, so who would you trust? Who would you interview if you were writing about the life of Jesus Christ and you lived at a contemporary time? Would you go talk to Judas? What about the soldiers who killed Jesus Christ? Right? They're going to have a completely different story than Judas is versus Caiaphas. What about Pilate? What about Herod? And if you say all of those men are, well, you know, Peter, James, and John are obviously really biased. So let's take their account, or maybe Peter, James, and John are equal in credibility as Judas or Herod, right? So that's a situation we're sitting in, and it is an attitude. Now, if you go into secular academia, there is no such thing recognized, right, as the spirit. There is no such thing recognized as, okay, a person's morality, different things like agendas in general. I mean, obviously, I'm kind of painting a broad stroke, but in general, like, you have to say Mormonism Unveiled is going to be just as credible as Lucy Mack Smith, because what if Lucy Mack Smith is covering things up or lying or something like that? Willard Chase might be trying to share something here that's valuable. But if you are coming at this saying, whoa, Willard Chase is the one that's literally leading the mob to attack Joseph Smith to steal the plates, right?
Which is ironic considering he says he doesn't have the gold plates, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
and then, he's involved in all this. Go ahead.
I guess. Oh, sorry. Quick.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So, is your take on okay? So, this kind of reminds me of the polygamy conversation, where it's almost like we have to pick our sources and our eyewitness sources, because it's on record, and maybe I'm wrong about the record. You've peered over the papers more than I have, but it seems to be on record that Joseph Smith had a Jupiter Talisman and that Brigham Young had a bloodstone.
I don't know. I've kind of read a lot of stuff that says that was ironically the guy trying to sell Jupiter Talismans like 25 years later was the one that said, "Oh, by the way, Joseph Smith had one of these." You know, and it's kind of like,
I don't know.
That is the problem with the talisman. So again, I'm gonna refer to I've criticized Fair Mormons sometimes in the past. Fair Mormon's not my enemy. In fact, some of their material on this is the best. If you go to their article, they have it all documented, the provenance. It comes up decades and decades and decades later. It was part of the sale from Louis Bideman's illegitimately born son. This is after Emma's died, and he's selling things off, and he's like, "Oh, this was owned by Joseph Smith," and he's like, "This was found on Joseph Smith's person." Well, that doesn't actually show up in the record after Joseph Smith was killed, and they kept the record of everything that he had. Yeah, go ahead.
I used to be on the same page as you about the Jupiter Talisman. I used to think that it wasn't a thing, and Cardin, for the same reasons that you just listed, is part of why. But then when I actually looked at the records, I found that Bideman had recorded twice in the journals of like other apostles who had gone back to talk with these people that Bideman had shown them the Jupiter Talisman like decades or like a decade before he ended up trying to sell it when they requested to have more things sent in. Right. And so like, there's definite provenance that it was at least handed down to him by Emma. I'm okay with being skeptical.
And now let's not also forget. So I'm just going to defend Emma a little bit here because, sorry, I'm a Smith, so I don't really like too much, and this is why. He treated her so terribly. I know that sometimes we look into the history, but we just mentioned before, Quaku mentioned, like, Joseph Smith's youngest son died in an insane asylum. He wrote a poem when he was 19 or 20 years old called The Horse and His Master, I think was the title. Anyways, talking about the abuse he suffered from Louis Bideman. Louis Bideman's the master and he's the horse. And it's this horrifyingly heartbreaking poem about who do you feel worse for, the horse that's beat up or the man that's beating the horse up, right? A man that would be so low to do that, or the victim. Like, who should we have more compassion for, the abuser or the victim? And just other stories and everything. So again,
can I offer my thing? Again, just like I say, we've got 3 modern affidavits from obvious lies of anti-Mormons just told about us on this show in the past 18 months. This just popped up a couple of weeks ago on eBay. Right now, there's somebody offering for $77,000 a daguerreotype of Joseph Smith and his wife, Emma Smith. And I've talked to experts about this, and they say there's no way that it can be him. It could be somebody tangentially related. There's a way that it could, be part of some family heirloom set of something. But this only popped up 2 weeks after what? The whole supposed daguerreotype of Joseph Smith, like 6 months ago, if you remember. How convenient that $77,000 daguerreotype, all right, pops up shortly after the whole idea that photographs of Joseph Smith enter the zeitgeist of profitability in the marketplace of Mormon artifacts, right? So to me, this is kind of like just I could see how the cash bias of wanting to sell artifacts of Joseph Smith could lead people to wanting to peddle talismans. I'm not saying that's what happened, but it leads me to be skeptical.
But the man wasn't a time traveler. How did he fake the apostles in their journals talking about it more than 10 years earlier without any financial reason?
Could it be true,
right?
that the Jupiter Talisman story from Louis Bideman is accurate, while Louis Bideman was also a horrible person?
That's what I'm thinking. And another portion of it, Kwaku, is like, I don't know that it was necessary that it was on his person when he died. Because like you said, Hannah, I've seen the record where it talks about like what they have on his body when he died. And so I don't know if that portion of the story is necessarily correct, but I mean, it seems to be a thing.
And
hey, I'd love it if we're correct. I love modern artifacts. I love going to Reed Moons and seeing all the cool crap he's collected. You know what I'm saying? I want one cool thing that we can go Indiana Jones in after. I'm not like anti that he did this. I don't
guess,
have a...
Yeah, that's the thing I'm wondering too, Hannah, is like...
Hannah had a response to
that.
Oh,
sorry,
yeah.
I can't see her.
No, I was gonna say, like, let's just say, let's move forward with the conversation, because I know that's where you're headed, of like saying, okay, well, what if it is legit?
Yeah.
And we can go down that road.
Yeah.
I just want to just help people when people are like, it's so solid. Our case is solid. Like, this is non-debatable. The case is closed. Really? Because are we really sitting here having this conversation saying the best we've got is Mormonism unveiled and artifacts that we don't even know for sure if Joseph Smith had, let alone why did he have them? Did someone give them to him? Did he use them? Was it something he was looking at like Freemasonry and says, this is apostate, I'm replacing it? We have no idea. So we can have a conversation. Well, what if it's legit? And I'm fine to have that conversation, but let's at least acknowledge that we're having a conversation about sources that are extremely, extremely debatable, and it's very uncertain.
And because, Hannah, the way I kind of look at it, and I will admit my bias, I think the magic's cool.
Yeah.
So do I want it to be true? A little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I'm admitting that bias there. But when you kind of think about it, I mean, to me, it doesn't seem out of place. The translation of the Book of Mormon, I mean, Urim and Thummim, that is magic. The golden plates, I mean, they appear and disappear by the angel's will. That's magic. Brigham Young's bloodstone, that's probably the most occult it gets. And then even after his death, you've got coffin canes with the hair of the prophet, the locks of Joseph Smith being used to heal people. There is this magic that keeps going even after his death. So, and I'm not passionate about that. I'm not trying to like say, oh, you're wrong. You might.
No. Yeah, you're bringing up good points that need to be discussed.
It's a bad thing. Like, could it just be maybe the Jupiter Talismans for some weird occult pagan stuff? But God can take weird things and make them. If Moses' staff can turn into a snake to eat the Pharaoh's staff snake, then he can make a Jupiter Talisman a Heavenly Father talisman.
I think what Hannah is saying here, and tell me if I'm misrepresenting you, Hannah. I think she's saying, don't let the Jupiter Talisman be the next Kinderhook plates, where obvious this thing that was created and was given to Joseph Smith. He checked it out with an enthusiasm saying, could be, maybe so, maybe not. But ultimately, as a fraud, he didn't translate it, couldn't translate it because it wasn't a gift from God.
Okay, before we go there, sorry, Carden, I have to pause you because I'm not the expert on the Kinderhook plates, but I have a friend that's actually done research into it. The Kinderhook plates that exist today versus the descriptions that were given of the ones Joseph Smith translated are very different. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that when Joseph Smith said he translated, I believe he was translating a legit artifact, but it's not the fakes we have today.
I'm with you. I'm with her. I thought this for a while.
Shut up, really?
Yeah, the Kinderhook plates are real.
Wait,
But
what?
the little bells we have now are BS. But there could have been that's not crazy.
So what
You're
they
not
were
crazy.
worried about happening to the 116 pages, you're saying happened to the Kinderhook plates?
Basically, this guy went. I'm trying to remember all the details because I'm not the one who did the original research. But when you actually walk through the letters of the ones who said, "Oh, we did this hoax on Joseph Smith and everything, and here's how we did it," and the artifacts we have today do not match the descriptions of what Joseph Smith had. There's discrepancies.
It's a hindsight 2020 con. I mean, it's similar to.
Well, yeah, it's why why God commanded that the 116 pages not get retranslated. Because then people would just do what apparently it looks like they did with the Kinderhook.
I don't know. For me, I mean, the Kinderhook plates, you have a pretty clear, prominent, like boat-looking figure, and if you look on like page 4 of the Gale, it's there, and it's almost exactly what Joseph Smith translated from it. Right? He was, in my mind, he was just looking at that one character and like, oh, hey, I recognize that from here, and it basically says this is about someone from the lines of Pharaoh. Awesome. Moving on, you know, that's my read of the Kinderhook plates.
I remember reading something about this when I was writing This Is the Show, but it was such a bit. I was like, I don't really have. I'm going to go with the fair Mormon narrative here, but this is kind of a whole thing that needs to be explored more. I do think it's something that maybe we could crack on the show because Hannah's not crazy. There really is something there, and I think it could be a game changer.
Oh, that's interesting.
But I'll also say it's sort of like the Book of Abraham, where we ignore the fact that the original descriptions are long papyri that are being rolled over tables and it goes on
take
forever.
like 2.5 rooms to
and
be
now,
able to contain.
Now we got like 2 pieces of paper the size of this, and we're like, must have been all that's there. It's like, wait a minute. The thing we have now could not even be kind of what Joseph Smith saw. And they're being held in Illinois, and there's a fire, and we're losing stuff in church history. Like, there is so much surrounding it, but we've just decided everything that's in the Book of Abraham must be on this little scroll right here. This rip of a scroll, and that's the end of the discussion. To me, that's kind of crazy.
Okay, so I do have a question. Do you have something to say, Brad?
It's from a little bit back. One thing I did want to say, what you were saying, Hannah, I think I totally agree on, like with the Jupiter Talisman. I do think Joseph Smith had it, but I do think we don't know what it meant to him.
And I'm fine with that, and we can talk about why, actually. So
because it's like we don't know what it meant to him, so to put onto it, like what I've seen other people do, where they'll be like, "Oh, Joseph Smith had this for the purpose of attracting money and women." It's like you don't know what he had this for.
Yeah, he
could have had a lucky rabbit's foot. Like
he was a
what
Smith.
The heck? But yeah, I think that one thing I agree with you on is that like for sure people will take leaps and bounds off of like way too small of evidence. And so that's where I'm.
Well, flesh out this
like
Jupiter Talisman thing.
I just want to say real quick, Jupiter Talismans do not work to get girls. They have not brought me. The Saturn disc does, believe it or not. You wave that in front of them and they're hypnotized.
Okay, well, no, we'll finish up your thoughts, Hannah, on the Jupiter Talisman. You said we can talk about why or why not. What happened? Finish it up because I do have another question for you after that before we round to a different topic. So yeah.
So I think the main conversation needs to be: could someone be involved with? So we have to set down what we're talking about here, right? So if we're talking about real forces. So, and this is something that the adversary doesn't want, or secularism, right, doesn't want us to acknowledge. So the devil has power, and that power is real. God also has power, and that power is real. You guys brought up a bunch of like biblical examples, 100%, right? So the question is, can those two forces be compatible with each other or used together? I do not believe scripturally you can support that conclusion. They're very different. They're in opposition to one another. I mean, if you just even look at the Book of Mormon, the way Mormon references witchcraft and magic, it's like you destroy it. New Testament, what happens when they go and they
the soothsayers,
right, they convert all these people. What do? They take their magic books and they burn them. What happened to Hiram Page's stone? It's a second or third hand account from Martin Harris's brother, but it says Joseph Smith had that stone ground to powder and all of the writings burnt. It's anything that has anything to do with the devil is destroyed. We don't touch it. And this is why. Because So God has a kingdom, God has a priesthood. Everything the devil does, and we see this in the temple, is to mimic it and create an opposite, right? And it's everything to oppose it. So the one fundamental difference between the priesthood and magic, and I think those terms are important. So, for example, we can talk about Joseph Smith's seer stones. Brigham Young talked about how Urim and Thummim and seer stones are actually a part of the Aaronic priesthood. So we're not talking about something that's just, oh, it's amoral and you just find it and you use it and whatever. No, this is contingent upon priesthood authority. And what is priesthood authority contingent on? Keys, right? I mean, otherwise we're getting into divergent group territory where it's like, go start your own church. You can marry anybody you want. You can do whatever you want. No, there's order. There's authority. It's also based on righteousness. You cannot exercise the power of God without righteousness.
Use the Liahono when your family is sinning.
Right. That's totally different than magic. You can use it no matter what.
Well,
in fact,
here's my question before my other question. If you say, look, it's like the scriptures say, and it's very black and white. There's the church of God and there's the church of the devil, which is the famous scripture in the Book of Mormon. Well, what about the Magi? Because the specific reference in the original Greek in every freaking manuscript we have, this was no translational accident, okay? They don't use the word for scribe, for priesthood holding priest. They don't use the word for apostle, deacon, presbyter, any of that. They use the term magi to insinuate that this is somebody who understood supernatural powers outside of the realm of God's approved priesthood, yet they were still the ones who kind of saved baby Jesus by not reporting him and were first to recognize the divinity of baby Jesus amongst all of the other great powers that be. We venerate them every Christmas with a little drummer boy next to him. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, are we, under your logic, we'd have to believe that they were of the Church of the Devil.
Well, first off, the little drummer boy was of the Church of the Devil.
Yeah.
And non-scriptural. I'm sorry, Hannah.
Exactly. Well, Justin Bieber made a sick version of it, so it's still in the zeitgeist. But anyway, how do you respond to that? Under that logic, we'd have to throw the three magi under the bus, right?
Well, I'm saying based on principles that Joseph Smith taught, for example, where he said, anyone who delves with anything in the realm of spirits, you better know the priesthood, otherwise you will be deceived. You don't know what you're dealing with.
So what were the magi doing? Were they bad guys now?
No, so what I would say is, how do we even know those manuscripts are 100% accurate when all of us acknowledge the Joseph Smith translation? All of us, and you go into Joseph Smith's translation changes, what does he say? The adversary went in and they took out plain and precious truths. He's changing things. You sit right there in Luke 2, right? Jesus Christ is sitting there in the temple with the priests and the doctors. And the text we read in King James says they were all asking him questions. Joseph Smith is like, actually, it was the opposite. They were all asking Jesus Christ questions, or a million other changes. There's thousands of JST changes. I'm not saying that text even needs to be changed. What I'm saying is, what I know is if those are men that are of God and are pure and holy, they would never touch the power of the devil. And I can say that, I know that from personal experience. I can say you can study the life of Joseph Smith. No great man who understands God's power is like, you know what? The devil's power is cool too. So I kind of go in and out, right? Sometimes I give a priest a blessing to my kids and I use God's authority, but sometimes it's just not enough. So sometimes I use the devil's power. Like, see, this just does not make sense. Why would you tap into and use Lucifer's power to do anything?
Okay. So this is, I guess, kind of the crux of the problem, really, because then you have people coming up to the seer stone, right? And saying, hey, if Joseph Smith was using this for money digging, how was he then using it to translate, right?
Right.
So I want to know, I guess, what your take is on that.
So again, I would say, what sources do we have that Joseph Smith was using his seer stones to go and do treasure digging and get money?
Aren't there the affidavits from that one court case where he was thrown under the bus by not finding water on some guy's property, which I totally understand
with
is a little
Josiah
bit.
Stoll.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah. With Josiah Stoll. Just because the only reason, I'm just going to tell you before you answer, Hannah, the only reason why I've been dubious of that is because all the time anti-Mormons are like, oh, yeah, but what about that court case when he was like 16? And I'm like, yeah, if we listen to what the FBI said about Martin Luther King, Like those people that were planting letters saying, oh, you should go suicide yourself before like we get to you, basically. You know what I'm saying? Like if we relied on everything that the US government said about, I don't know, pop stars in the 60s, like everybody would be damnable charlatans, right? So I take that all with a grain of salt.
So you're speaking of the 1826 trial. So just to clarify a few things, right? There was a legit court hearing, but it was not a trial. It was an examination. An examination is anyone is legal right to sue in this country. Anyone can sue me. They can sue any of us, but they have to come to court and they have to prove that they even have a legitimate case to go to trial. There's no evidence that this case ever went to trial. Mm-hmm. Joseph Smith was never convicted because it never even went to trial to get a conviction. It was an examination. Oliver Cowdery talks about this in his letters to W.W. Phelps, which, by the way, were him responding to Mormonism Unveiled and a bunch of the other propaganda that was going on at the time. He says Joseph Smith's brought in, it's completely found unfounded, and he's let off honorably. No court documents exist to this day documenting what happened during the examination. So all of the supposed affidavits actually come decades later from anti-Mormon publications. And when you actually read those anti-Mormon publications, they say things like, Joseph Smith was convicted. Joseph Smith was found guilty.
Which is all not true.
She's good.
And Joseph Smith Sr. is supposedly saying in these affidavits, he's like, I just wish my son would just be more honorable. And, he just is getting into the ways of the world. And I really hope he repents. And it talks about Joseph Smith going to Sally Chase, who was the sister to Willard Chase, the village witch, who was looking in her occultic glass to find the plates, right? So wait, really? And then hold on, everyone. Let's remember the time. 1826. When did Joseph Smith have the first vision? 1820, 6 years before. So you're telling me that Joseph Smith entered the presence of the Father and the Son, spoke to them personally, greatest vision in recorded history, visions that none of us in this room are even worthy to have ourselves.
Well, Joseph might be.
No.
No, I just can't keep going.
Right? Joseph Smith has that at 14. He understands what the power of God is. He knows God's kingdom. He knows things about God's authority and his priesthood that none of us can even comprehend. And then 6 years later, he's hanging out with the village witch. This is at the same time he's preparing to get the plates. Like, this makes no sense. If this is who Joseph Smith is, I am sorry. I lose all my respect for him because I have a better understanding of spiritual experiences than he ever could.
And I guess, I don't know, I feel like that's part of the danger to me of this argument is that if we lose all respect for Joseph Smith, if we find out that he was doing something different than what we think he should have been doing, I don't know. I feel like we need to have more grace for our...
Let me clarify what I mean by that.
Okay.
What I mean is I am someone who is nowhere near anywhere as great as Joseph Smith, period. Not in the same universe. But I have had enough spiritual experiences in my life where I know that the power of the devil is very real. I also know that the power of God is very real. I have experienced miraculous healings. I have literally been sick in bed, couldn't get out, had a huge fireside I had to give, got a priest a blessing. Within 10 minutes, I was in the car on my way to go. I know this stuff is real. I know different experiences like visions and dreams and prophecy are real. I have seen them in my life, and I've experienced the power of God enough to know that there is a difference between the power of God and the power of the devil. And anyone who pays the price to have those experiences knows they are very different. They're in opposition to each other, and you cannot blend the two. So when I say, if Joseph Smith is blending the two, then I'm saying he is someone who doesn't even have the same understanding of God that I do.
So I do think there is room for there to be magic present in Joseph Smith's life. For
like
example,
middle class magic, you're saying, not like devil, you know what I'm saying? Like, okay.
And this isn't me being argumentative because I think you raised a lot of really good points and you're able to deliver them in a way that's very, very convincing.
Yes.
Yeah, I feel like a bad person if I disagree with you.
But I mean, when you really, if you think about a couple things, the standard to which the Old Testament prophets are the standard to be an Old Testament prophet allows for more magic than we often allow for Joseph Smith.
So
For
is
example,
that magic or is that priesthood? Like, I think what terms we use are really, really important. Are we talking about them using the authority of God and the power of God, or are we talking about a different power?
Well, I mean, that binary itself I would challenge because you say there's no neutral.
Well,
there are no neutral people, but I do think there is neutral energy. And I think let's just take Abraham, for example. Abraham, before his calling, before he met with God, by all accounts, was a pagan. I mean, Abraham was not this, knew the gospel. It was introduced to him in the scriptures. Abraham came from a magical worldview. Even the vision of Ezekiel is one of the more trippy, uncomfortable. If someone had a vision similar to Ezekiel in the church right now, we'd be like, "Okay, you saw a demon." For sure, we would say that. So I do think there is a more I hate the word nuance because I feel like it's the word that everyone uses to be a cop-out, but there is a magical, somewhat occult side to spirituality, and just because it can seem creepy or more pagan doesn't necessarily mean it's evil. I do think there is neutral energy, else how would we have literal magician fights in the scriptures? How would we have shape-shifting objects? How would we have... another example is Moses is of a royal lineage, but doesn't know. And he is, by all accounts, a pagan until he has his calling made sure. So, I mean, I kind of think there is room for Joseph Smith to meet with the God the Father and Jesus Christ and also delve into that magic, because what is he told? He's told those creeds are an abomination. He's given a vision by God, and God says, great, they're all wrong. And God kind of leaves, and he's got to figure stuff out. And he's talking to angels that are appearing at midnight in the moonlight, and he's being given stones and a bow to translate. I mean, the whole thing is magical. It doesn't seem crazy to me that he would maybe go talk to a witch or two. And maybe I'm alone there. Maybe I'm alone. But, it doesn't seem crazy.
Okay, so hold on. You brought up a number of examples like Moses or Abraham or pagans, but what specifics do we have, right? Someone not knowing the gospel is totally different than someone learning the arts of using Satan's forces, right?
And being a normie is different than being an actual occultist.
No, however, but using magic in the land, using Egyptian magic in the land present without a knowledge of the gospel, I'm presuming, by your standard you've put out, that would be magic of the devil.
What I'm saying is, number one, we don't even know if Abraham or Moses ever did that. So we're kind of setting up a false theory, like we have no idea whether he even ever did. Number two, Joseph Smith didn't grow up in Egypt with a family that was all involved in Egyptian magic. He grew up in a home, before he's even born, Lucy Mack Smith literally almost has a near-death experience where she consecrates her life to the Lord. Joseph Smith Sr. is having dreams like the Lehi's Tree of Life. Asel Smith, read his letters. Asel Smith is the man who's saying, do everything in soberness to God. Don't even pray to God unless you're doing it with steadfast worship. Joseph Smith's ancestors were literally speaking against the women in the Salem witch trials, right? And that's a whole thing we could get into, right? But they were on the side of testifying against. They're coming from a Puritan background. They're not coming from Egypt that's like, oh, this is really cool, let's go do the Ouija board at night. They're coming from the Bible is what we use. They're coming from a culture that even was trying to outlaw Christmas in a lot of different ways. Yeah,
that was weird. Congress didn't recognize Christmas until the 1800s. It's like, how do you not do that?
By the way, I guess this is another question I have. What is your take on early Mormonism and the magic worldview?
Okay.
Is it problematic for the same reasons, or?
Well, so D. Michael Quinn wrote it. He started it before the Hoffman forgeries were exposed, right? So he started with the Salamander letter, and the entire book was crafted around
assuming that was true.
assuming that was true, and then it's the research after that. So if you go through the book, I'm trying to remember the man who did the review of it. And was it William Hamblin in the Farms Review? I'm trying to remember. Sorry. It's been a couple of years since I read.
It's like this random encyclopedia of, let's talk about this deep random church history
The shame
question.
that you feel for not recognizing something completely obscure is actually quite impressive. So anyway, continue.
Yeah, no worries. We can look it up later.
I want to make sure I'm precise and I don't give any, but I believe it was him. But he talks about how he says the book really has a salamander hole in it because everything was shaped around, okay, we know Joseph Smith was involved in magic because of the salamander letter. Now let's go down a rabbit hole of other things. So if you actually walk through, again, it's the same things. Mormonism Unveiled is taken at face value. It's like Willard Chase is legit. Everything is totally credible. A lot of stuff is second, third, fourth hand. And you're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Okay, we're getting a little bit. Mm-hmm. I mean, if anybody tried to create history based on so many random dots based on like, well, if this is true, then maybe this. And then if that's true, then maybe this. And then if that's true, maybe this. You're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. And we're framing our whole construct that Joseph Smith was dabbled in power that was coming from the very opposite of God, when if you actually look at his, again,
do you think
do
you think there's room for other people perceiving him as dabbling in powers that were unauthorized, but he was actually working within the realm of priesthood authority?
Maybe rephrase that just so I want to make sure I'm understanding exactly what you're saying. Yeah.
Do you feel like there could be room for people to have said, hey, Joseph Smith is doing these occult things when really he was using stuff that was authorized by God, right?
Well, like, sure, he says Moroni shows up and they're like, okay, this has to be a demonic spirit. We know actually it wasn't. It was a messenger sent from God. Yeah. So absolutely, right? But again, who are we going to go to understand? Are we going to sort through a dunghill to figure out if there's a pearl in there, or are we actually just going to go to the clean source, right? Like Joseph Smith always said, he was like, pure water tastes best from the spring. So I don't need to go to Willard Chase to understand about Moroni. I can just go straight to Joseph Smith and say, what happened here? Oh, okay, here's what happened. Lucy Mack Smith, right?
But also, Hannah, to me, it seems like it feels like we're picking marbles from crystals, because we have Moroni appearing to Joseph, leading him to plates dug in the ground that disappear and come back by Moroni's will. He's using objects to translate them, and he's putting these glowing stones in a hat to see the letters that appear and the images that appear on the rock. I mean, that whole process, you could call it priesthood as well, but that is a form of that is magic, especially because the priesthood wasn't even restored yet.
But the priesthood was in operation. I mean, what is the priesthood? The priesthood is the power of God, right?
Yeah, and that is the phrase. Like when I look back at the records that talk about Joseph Smith and the translation of the Book of Mormon, the phrase over and over and over again that we see all throughout is that they were translated by the gift and power of God more than anything else. And I think people oversimplify this sometimes as though it was only through a rock and a hat that he translated. But to me, the record looks like there was a mix of different ways that he translated.
Well, I mean, right. But I mean, by this logic, is it the power of God going back to Abraham's day? Is it the power of God to sacrifice an animal for blessings, or is that a pagan practice that God had to redeem through his son? Because Abraham seems to know, hey, sacrifice your son Isaac. I mean, we know that is not the practice that God wants, but that was a pagan practice. And perhaps, I mean, you could say it was a satanic practice, because that is how they made offerings to their foreign gods, but that was still used in a way for good through the Lord. So could not these rituals that may be from either neutral or the dark powers be redeemed in a way that God can use?
Okay, so we have to make sure we're getting all of our history right. Like when Abraham takes Isaac up on the altar, he is completely a follower of Jehovah at that point. This is not Abraham pagan who then becomes a follower of Jehovah after sacrifice.
I understand that, but the idea of sacrificing an animal for blessings from your God. Everyone did that. That
it started with Adam and Eve in the Book of Moses.
Oh, snap!
Yeah,
that was awesome.
I won't open that door because that's a little controversial.
Well, I was about to say, looks like we got another podcast coming up.
There's
awesome.
a sprinkle of Gnosticism I may have on that subject. I don't know if I should.
So now I'm going to wrap this up first really fast because I know you got to go, and we don't want to keep you all day, and we could keep you all day because you're.
Yeah, and I have one thought just to wrap that up.
Then finish up your thought. I just want to make sure. I'll give you the last word, but if I were to summarize everything you've said here so far, it kind of seems like you're saying, "Hey, I don't think Joseph Smith was a treasure digger." Because it comes across to me as a bunch of leftover slander from the first anti-Mormon book published in 1838 called Mormonism Unveiled that has gone through 17 permutations and has just continued in the groupthink of anti-Mormonism to the modern day, and that most of this is just recycled garbage that's been either used to personally profit or to slander the prophet in an anti-Mormon way. And there's no actual kind of solid contemporaneous proof that the Smith family or Joseph Smith himself actually practiced folk magic to any substantive degree. Is that kind of a fair summary, would you say?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Let me add on the treasure digging. So Joseph Smith himself, this is the famous quote in the Times and Seasons, where he's getting confronted with people asking him, why were you a treasure digger? What does he say? He says, I was hired with an old gentleman by Josiah Stoll. He had heard something of a silver mine being in the state of Pennsylvania. This is ... You can read the whole quote. I'm just skipping the unnecessary details. He said, previous to my hiring with him, had been digging in order to, if possible, discover the mine. After I went to live with him, he took me among the rest of his hands to dig for the silver mine, at which I continued to work for nearly a month without success in our undertaking. And finally, I prevailed with the old gentleman to cease digging after it. Hence arose the very prevalent story of my having been a money digger. So according to Joseph Smith, he's saying, all of these stories are coming from this instance. So we have to ask ourselves, is Joseph Smith covering up other stories, or is he telling the truth? Some scholars have suggested that Joseph Smith is covering up the truth. That this is one quote, and I won't tell you who said this, but it's in our books. But they said, faced with rumors that he was in these treasure digging activities, Joseph Smith rarely mentioned his participation in treasure digging, and never in great detail. But neither did he deny his early activities. The caution with which Joseph Smith wrote about his involvement in treasure digging suggests that he was mindful of an audience largely skeptical of such activity. In other words,
who said it?
We want names.
It was Arrington, wasn't it? It was Leonard.
Who said it?
It was Bushman.
Who said it? Come on.
Bushman.
It was Stephen Smith.
It was Stephen Smith, wasn't it?
Oh.
Look at her.
Faith Crisis 1. It's in Faith Crisis 1. But basically what they're saying, right, is Joseph Smith covered it up because people wouldn't want to hear it. So Joseph
I don't know.
Smith
I guess when I hear stuff like that, it's not something that would bother me a ton if they're talking about treasure digging and there's some history of him using his seer stone to find things for people. And this is the instance in which it was having to do with like digging for treasure specifically, is with Josiah Stoll, right? Where he used it to look for other things besides treasure buried underground. I don't know. To me, it's a murky enough thing that it's never really bothered me. I don't think there's enough evidence out there to impugn Joseph Smith as though he was some evil sorcerer guy tricking people with.
Now,
Okay,
and here's
fast,
where
fast.
I'm
Do it
dumb.
fast, quick.
Okay,
We gotta go.
I am dumb here. I am dumb. I recognize I'm a dumb guy, but I feel like if I accept what you say about this to be logically consistent with accepting historical record and what Joseph Smith says, I have to accept Jacob Isbell's view on polygamy. You know, because it kind of, hear me out. But it's like when he was on here and he was like, Bradley, let me give you an example. Could it be possible that Joseph Smith was an honest person his entire life? He never lied about polygamy once, and he's on record saying he never practiced it. And you're like, what do we do with this? And I feel like confused. I'm like, I feel like if I'm gonna pick you, I gotta pick
And that's where for me, like I feel like the standard, it kind of ends up being a place where we put too much of a emphasis on something that isn't necessarily that important. Like, he wasn't lying to say that that was his like main thing that made him known for money digging.
Joseph
right?
Smith is responding, and he's saying, this is the extent of my treasure digging. So are we
She's winning me over with primary sources, man. All I get is shame-based eye rolls from academics saying, well, I wouldn't say that. But she's like coming at me with original freaking journals from Lucy Mack Smith. I'm on your team,
But dog,
Hannah.
this is the same
I'm on your team. Except for you're wrong about the Magi. I like the Magi and the little drummer
I like
boy.
Wizard Joseph. I like Wizard Joseph, but dog, this
And
is
I'm
the
still
same
gonna buy
thing.
the Jupiter Talisman in the museum bookstore.
This feels like, and I'm not trying to equate you with Jacob Isbell at all. I'm not doing that because you two are worlds apart. But it feels similar.
It's a very similar argument.
Where it's like, look, Joseph did say I'm not. He said I don't do spiritual wifery. It's like, okay,
it's actually completely different though, because there's not just Joseph Smith. There's Brigham Young, Eliza R. Snow. There's Mary Elizabeth Rollins-Leitner, Helen Mark Kimball, Heber C. Kimball, Benjamin F. Johnson. There's a million Peter, James, and Johnses here who are giving us a complete picture, taking a couple of Joseph Smith statements out of context and disregarding the testimony of many other loyal and faithful men and women who said, like Eliza R. Snow, she said, this is why I signed the paper denouncing spiritual wifery. I still deny it to this day. Was I denying plural marriage? No. Was I denying the corrupt, evil counterfeit? Absolutely 100%. If you take Jacob Isbell's perspective or others in the Doctrines of Christ, they believe Eliza R. Snow was a liar and basically an adulteress, essentially, right? Because what is polygamy if it's not sanctioned by God? It's full-on adultery. Mm-hmm. Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, all these men. And I'm saying, no, they were not. Eliza R. Snow was an honorable woman. So we're not talking about, the completely different arguments.
I'm with you.
That would be fascinating.
I'm saying Judas Iscariot is not trustworthy, but Peter, James, and John are.
And Hannah, I've actually used that same argument many times. And I really, really appreciate this conversation. And it's made me want to go back and reread some of these sources on specifically the treasure digging, because I've just kind of taken that one for granted.
Yeah, you've convinced me. I'm on your team, and all you academics that hate her, you got to come on my show to
prove you otherwise.
Me, to prove me otherwise, man. I'm leveraging it. It's like those people that say like, I'm going to go inactive if you don't stop doing X, Y, or Z thing.
Because for me, I don't know that I'm necessarily convinced, because I also don't know that this is something weighted to the way that it would convince me he wasn't a prophet if it turned out it were true. You know, that from where I'm at, you're
just saying it's not a game breaker, right?
Yeah, it's not going to break Joseph Smith as a prophet for me.
Well,
but I really appreciate everything that you're saying, and I'll definitely look up your article, and especially understanding that circle magic quote.
Where can people find you and check out your stuff?
Okay, so the josephsmithfoundation.org, just really simple. And we have the Faith Crisis books and the different things on that topic. But Carden, I do still have to wrap up because I responded to everything.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, you got 60 seconds. 60 seconds. Do it.
So I want to close with Gordon B. Hinckley. So Gordon B. Hinckley in the talk, Lord Increase Our Faith. This is 1987. This is a few years after Richard Bushman comes out with Joseph Smith and the Beginnings of Mormonism. And the new Mormon history that we talked about in the other interview with Leonard Arrington is picking up. This is what he says. This is in the Ensign, November 1987 General Conference. Gordon B. Hinckley says, another phenomenon is described as the writing of a new history of the church, as distinguished from the old history. So what is he talking about here? He's talking about the New Mormon history that we've been talking about. It represents, among other things, an effort to ferret out every element of folk magic and the occult in the environment in which Joseph Smith lived, to explain what he did and why. Sounds like Rev. Stonerling? Yes. And other sources. I have no doubt, Gordon B. Hinckley says, there was folk magic practiced in those days. Without question, there were superstitions and the superstitious. I suppose there was some of this in the days when the Savior walked the earth. There is even some in this age of so-called enlightenment. The fact that there were superstitions among the people in the days of Joseph Smith is no evidence whatever that the church came of such superstition. So again, Gordon B. Hinckley was involved in the committee with the leaders that shut down Richard Bushman's book when it was going to be published by the church in the sesquicentennial history. This debate has been going on for a long time. Joseph F. Smith publicly said Joseph Smith was no treasure digger. That's coming from Joseph Smith's nephew. Again, this is the family around the time saying these are lies. Joseph F. Smith said this was all done to slander him. So again, just to kind of sum up, we've been talking about the history, but the reason why I believe it matters is, again, because if you've got the power of God and you've got an opposing power, everything Satan does is to mimic or mock Jesus Christ. Everything. He uses the cross. You study Satanism, they have a Bible, they have a priesthood, they have robes, they have ceremonies, but it's all twisted. And so the reason why I think it matters is because if you start graying the lines, we have an entire generation of youth today who can't tell the difference between Harry Potter and the power of God. And the reason why that is serious is because we live in one of the most deceptive ages. More than ever before, we need to be able to understand how to discern a true spirit from a false spirit. Look at all the people like the Chad Daybells and the Lori Vallows, and they all go down this line where they can't tell the difference. And it's like, oh, it doesn't matter. We got portals. Joseph Smith had portals. I have portals. I've got this. I've got that, right? And they can't tell the difference between the two. We need to be able to exercise discernment to be able to tell, because it does matter. And the power of God and the priesthood is completely different than the power of the devil. Sorry.
Okay. We got our heart out. That's awesome. Her name is Hannah Stoddard. The group is, the website is ldsanswers.org.
Oh, Michelle Stone just texted me. She says, I want to box her. So I guess...
That's funny. This is Midnight Mormon. See you guys in the next program.